My name is Elmer Bulthuis. I work as a CTO for Gameye, and also I'm responsible for the company culture. I started developing, or I wrote my first line of code when I was 8 years old, and I never really stopped. So I'm still doing it and loving it. I got 2 children. Those are also 2 things I love, 2 people. And yeah, that's it for me.
Hi, my name is Junior Mba. I am the integration manager at Gameye. A brief background on myself, is I used to work for a company called Game Analytics beforehand. That was my first foray into the gaming industry. And prior to that, I worked at several different industries, such as retail and finance, working in the support team, doing various bits. I've been at Gameye now for about a year, and it's going well. Gameye has been around for about 5 years now. It was founded in 2017. What makes us stand out is we are very agnostic in our nature. So for us, we pride ourselves on being able to fit in with whatever tech stack you're using. So the idea here is you don't have to switch what you're using to work with us. We try to fit in with what you use, and that way it sort of makes it easier for our customers. Projects we've worked on so far is a few game launches. We have several projects internally going on all the time, whether it's improving the architecture, the service, things like that. One of the things what we are very proud of is working with Chivalry for the launch. So that was one of the biggest launches we've had so far at Gameye.
Chivalry, we've been testing with Chivalry for a very long time. I think even 2 years. I think we looked it up when the launch was done. Our first contact was about 2 years earlier. So we were talking to them very early. And also, that's why we integrated with them already very early. So we had a lot of time to test integration and everything like that. They were already working with us for the alpha release as well, and also for the releases there for many testing releases. So yeah, it took a pretty long time to get from the first contact to the actual launch of the game. But it also gave us a chance to know each other a little bit and understand what our needs were and build a relationship, because I think if you like each other, it's much easier to work together. Yeah, so it took a while. I don't really call it a challenge, but there was a thing that happened, and it was basically, there was a bug on our side, and it only happened with Chivalry and not with any other clients. It was actually a mixture between a bug in Chivalry and a bug in us, depending on how you look at it. Anyway, what was going on is that Chivalry was writing to standard out and did it in a way that it was not asynchronous. It was blocking the event loop or the game loop. And we were reading it synchronously. So there was a little bit of a delay. The event was written and it was waiting until we read it. It's very, if you know anything about development, this is a really weird thing to come across. But anyway, we fixed it. And after that, everything was smooth. Also, before that, everything was smooth. Only this one thing was a problem. So the launch itself was great, actually, in many ways. There was, it was the biggest launch we ever did. So you do your calculations, you do your testing and everything looks fine. So we did some optimizations to make sure that nothing would break. But still, when on the moment the game launches, you feel like the ground falls beneath you or something like that. It's very stressful, I think.
So for us, sort of managing the scaling of users, it was more a case of first anticipating sort of the nature of the launch, also the incoming numbers. So working with the guys at Chivalry, we kind of sort of created a scenario where we anticipated perhaps the numbers from different regions, and then we factored that into sort of our allocation of servers across our farm, just to make sure that when we did see a spike in certain areas, that we were able to manage that and scale across the platform laterally, as well as eventually, if there was a need, we were able to also scale into the cloud as well. So the different approach for different time zones and regions was more a case of, usually how it works is you have your peak in Europe, and sort of as that starts dipping, you then have a peak in America. And then as that peak is dipping, then you have another peak in Asia as well. So for us, it's just making sure that we had enough servers to cope with these peaks, and also just making sure that we had the different providers available should there be an issue in any of these areas. One of the cool things about Gameye as well is that we don't cherry pick providers. So we don't have a specific person that we work with. So we try to work with as many different providers as possible. And that way we have like backups in different areas, just in case anything happens. So we can actually switch without the users or the studio noticing any issues beforehand. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
So one of the challenges that we had, well, not only for Chivalry, but Chivalry was our first big launch. Before that, we had little launches. We used to have a database, and a database is not a bad thing per se. Only if you want to scale more, then you might want to upgrade your database, or in our case, completely remove the database. When we were doing small launches, we could already see that this database would become a bottleneck. You know, even if we would make it bigger, it would become a bottleneck still only a little further away, you know. So we decided to completely remove it. No database means that it cannot be a bottleneck. The less you have, the less, you know, problems you have with it. So we decided to create a completely decentralized system, of course, with a central API that you can use to orchestrate it. And now we have a system that is basically it's state everywhere. We have microservices that have state. You could look at state as a form of cache that's updated in real time. Every state that we have is derived from where it originates. So in our case, it means that if a game server is up, that is the origin of the state. It's up or down. That's a very simple example of a state. Is it running or is it not running? So if you want to know if your game server is running, we're just going to ask the server. We're not going to go to some database to figure out if it is up and running, because why should we do that? We can also ask, you know, the one responsible. Also, it has another advantage, and that is that if you have a database that is where you store your state, you need to keep it in sync with reality. In our case, our game servers being up and down, we need to sync that. We had to sync that with our database. Of course, there are some things you need to store in a database, like API keys, the names of our clients, locations of images, stuff like that. But this is pretty statical data. The data doesn't really change a lot. Game servers going on and off, that's the state that changes a lot. And we derive that state from where it originates. And that's how we do it now, and it works like a charm. Actually, something that we're kind of proud of. We used to have a database that kind of tracked our sessions. So if you would start a session somewhere, it would be an entry in the database. And also if you would stop it, it would be an entry in the database or a change to the database. So if you want to, like, for instance, what happened during the Chivalry launch is that at some point we got about 300 sessions in an instant. If you want to update your database, depending on your database, of course, but it also means 300 transactions. And maybe it is doable in most modern database, but you need to have some, you know, a little more, you know, it's going to be a more expensive database. Also, there's an end to it, because if you can handle 300 transactions in a second, all right, great. But what if it would be like 5,000, or maybe what if it would be 10,000? There is a physical limit to it. So storing data in about sessions in the database is something that would be your go-to solution, I guess. But it doesn't really make sense because you can get the information elsewhere. And if you get it elsewhere, then there are, I don't know, maybe like let's, for argument's sake, say we have 10 machines. We have much more, but if we had 10 machines, you have to ask 10 machines what their state is. You're asking, so the load is already distributed among 10 machines. Now, the service asking that, you could divide it like, okay, we have two services. Service 1 is asking the first 5, and service 2 is asking the other 5. So now we already have that distributed as well. The final step would then is to aggregate that data, which is something that we can do incrementally, because we look at it as a real-time cache. So state equals cache in this case. So if something changes on one of those machines, so let's say something changes in machine number 10, it's passed to the service that is handling that machine, and that service passes to whoever wants to know that. So, and at the same time, we have, we do the same, so we call this sharding. It's a very common practice to make something horizontally scalable. We do the same thing for our clients. So maybe client 1 to 5 are handled by service 1, client 6 to 10 are handled by service 2. And if you do like that, we can, that's how we decentralize most of our system. And also it scales really well because if you have more clients, you just add more services. There's always a physical limit, but in this case, the physical limit is very hypothetical, I guess. Yeah.
I think so. In terms of managing sort of launches and sort of unpredictability of perhaps people loving your game and sort of your sessions is suddenly increasing, it's kind of a something we get asked a lot by the smaller studios. They're a bit worried. So we have one studio currently in beta. And they're kind of worried about whether the game becomes very popular and then all of a sudden their bill spikes, right? So I think one of the great things about Gameye is you only really pay for those peaks. So you're not locked into a specific pricing strategy for, let's say you have to get X amount of machines and so that's what you have to pay for, right? So with us, we allow you to focus on just making sure the game is running well. So if you do have a peak and then all of a sudden it gets lower, that's the payment for that kind of balances out because there isn't like a higher price line for, let's say, a bunch of servers. So I think for studios that kind of reduces the headache a bit. So they're not really worried about paying a lump sum out just to sort of test out their games in different areas. You can release your game if you want to try out in a different region that's not as popular. We give you the flexibility to do that. There isn't a additional price for trying your game in, let's say, a less popular area like Dubai or I don't know, a server in Mumbai, for example. The way we run our farm is it's kind of, you know, we allow you to try these areas out to see how it works for your game, and you can essentially just tailor your server presence or region presence based on your players rather than what you can afford. So I'm not sure if there are tools out there to sort of analyze sort of your potential player base. But it is one of those areas that's kind of unpredictable to sort of manage because you can to a certain extent predict sort of your player baseline based on sort of the players you've had in alpha and beta and closed and open beta. But at some point, sort of the real world scenario comes in. So for instance, you can have a certain amount of players up until launch, and then all of a sudden a streamer plays your game, and then you just see like a huge influx of players all of a sudden, and that's not really what you anticipated. So I think it's always, what I would say is you should always overestimate when sort of predicting numbers, because that way at least you can find like a middle ground between a ridiculous number and sort of what the number actually will be, and then sort of that middle ground just to anticipate any additional influx as well. So yeah, so that's probably what I would advise in that instance.
It's not like there's a tool that you can go to, but one of the things that I like to do for Gameye also is, if you can just imagine the worst case scenario, which is basically nobody loves your game. The best case scenario is everybody loves your game. If the difference between those two is really big, if those two, because you can put a number on those scenarios. If the difference is really big, and usually with games it is pretty big, then you need a lot of flexibility, because the risk is big. Basically, it means you don't know what's going to happen. If the difference between the worst and the best case scenario is very small, well, then you can be pretty confident that you need less flexibility. Only with gaming, like you said, Junior, if a streamer jumps on your game, then if it's really popular, that might spike it. So this is a risk. So it's very uncommon that the worst and the best case scenario is very close to each other. That's why we need a lot of flexibility. This is one of the things why Gameye exists, actually, why we started it, because the launches are so important for your game. You can only make a first impression once, right? And the launch is like a first impression. People buy your game, or maybe they play it for free. If it doesn't work, then you look really bad. And also at the same time, it's very important that it goes well. Also at the same time, having that flexibility is not that easy. So that's why I started the company, because I can see that this is necessary for the world.
So advice I'd give for some indie developers, I'd probably tell them to focus more on their players and sort of where they're based, whether it's trialing this out through beta and sort of figuring out specifically where their players are located, and then that way transferring that to sort of the provider you use for your server orchestration, and just making sure that the locations actually match up to where your players actually are. And then that way if you do have to sort of stump up some money for sort of paying for this side of things, at least you know that you're paying for people to actually use the server locations. And then that way it's sort of beneficial for both you and your players. It kind of makes everyone happy on both sides.
One of the things that we also provide is they can experiment with different integrations. We have integration with various matchmaker. So if you're not sure about what matchmakers you want to use, well, we can do any matchmaker, and it doesn't cost a thing. So that's one of the advantages of flexibility, I guess, is that you can just try it, and if you don't like it, you don't do it, and if you do, then you do it.
I would say test your online element as early as possible, whether it's just you and the other developers testing the sort of real world scenario, which is obviously the matchmaking and server orchestration, or just the server orchestration side of things. I would say think about it as early as possible, and perhaps try it as early as possible, because you might find one is more flexible than the other, and sort of it allows you to pick what's best for you guys, rather than what you only have time for towards the end. Yeah.
Don't believe the hype. So don't just do something because everybody does it, but figure out if you need it. And also, so this would mean if you need to build something yourself, think about, do you really need to build it yourself? Or also, if you're gonna, use a service from another company, also think about, wouldn't it be better if I built this myself? So it works two ways. Really think about what you need, and don't go doing something because everybody else does it. Maybe in your prototype phase or something like that to speed up development a little bit. But in the end, if you're building a game, it's a very expensive piece of software. It's a very big thing. You need the flexibility. to make it exactly the way you want it. And yeah, so only I would only buy things that are very generic, like hosting.